What other things might the NSA be doing? To answer that, you have to understand what the NSA actually does and how it works.
The average person doesn't have a concept of the massive capability that is available to the National Security Agency. Forget about the idea of the guy with the earphones on listening to something. That's not what happens. You know, the calls are being sucked up by the millions, and not just the calls, you're engaged in this data mining.
It's essentially looking for certain kinds of signals in an almost Herculean task, a much, much larger communications environment to find the things that actually have intelligence value.
Data mining, sifting through oceans of phone calls and internet traffic. That's a far cry from what President Bush described. Targeted intercepts of point-to-point Al-Qaeda communications.
Another feature of data mining is that you don't have any individualized suspicion going in. They don't say, hey, we're looking for something that Hedrick Smith is doing. They are just collecting the data, and then the analysis of the data gives rise to suspicion of individuals based on these connections.
The inside story of what the NSA has actually been up to was discovered here in San Francisco by Mark Klein, a longtime internet technician for AT&T.
In 2002, I was sitting at my workstation one day, and some email came in saying that somebody from the National Security Agency, NSA, was going to come visit for some business. This NSA representative showed up at the door. I happened to be the one who opened the door. I let him in.
He was doing a background check for security clearance for one of our field engineers. He was going to be working at the Folsom Street office, and they were building a secure facility there.
And I heard from our manager, Don, that he's working on some new room that's being built. So people start speculating, oh, what's this new room being built?
Mark Klein got suspicious when the workmen constructing the room treated it as hush-hush. So how do you know that it wasn't just some kind of newfangled AT&T thing that was going beyond what had already been established for its security purposes elsewhere?
They wouldn't need the NSA for that purpose. The odd thing about the whole room, of course, was that only this one guy who had clearance from the NSA could get in there. So that changes the whole context of what this is about.
Klein's job was to maintain AT&T's internet service for several million customers. Domestic and international traffic all mixed together.
We're talking about billions and billions of bits of data going across every second, right?
A coworker showed Klein how their internet room was directly connected to the secret NSA room through a special device called a splitter.
So what they do with a splitter is they intercept that data stream and make copies of all the data, and those copies go down on the cable to the secret room.
What this thing was is a very full-scale device to take all communication, voice and data, and send it both wherever it was supposed to go, but also shut it off to a little listening room.
So what exactly was going on in that listening room? Klein found clues at work one day.
I came across these 3 documents, and I brought them back to my desk. And when I started looking at it, I looked at it more, and finally it dawned on me sort of all at once, and I almost fell out of my chair.
Klein eventually found detailed designs for the secret room. One of the first to see his documents was internet expert Brian Reed.
Lord, they had a lot of hardware, and I mean, they could, with the computers that they had there, they could do anything they wanted with that data. There was serious compute power available to process that wiretap data.
But then there was one thing that was odd, because I didn't recognize it. It was not part of normal day-to-day telecommunications equipment that I was familiar with, and that was a NARUS, N-A-R-U-S, NARUS STA 6400.
The NARUS STA 6400 made me sit up and take notice and realize that this was not an amateur game. And so when you see a NARUS box and all that storage space and all that compute power, you can't help but think, Wow, this is some heavy-duty processing power here to really analyze the data that is siphoned off. What is going on?
The term NARS is Latin for to know. The way our software works is it monitors all of the traffic on the internet, all of the ones and zeros that make up all of the data that you and I generate when we're looking at web pages or when corporations are sending emails back and forth. All of that information, we just sort of peer into the pipes, if you will, and look at the ones and zeros as they go by.
Peering into the pipes. What does that mean?
It's sort of analogous to a letter inside of an envelope. So you've got different layers in these things we call packets. And, the first layer that you get to peer back is the information about where the packet's coming from and where it's going to, the addresses that identify, who's communicating with who. And then once you delve into deeper parts of the packets, that's when you get into what's called the payload. And that includes the actual information that you're trying to send in the packet.
The content.
The content of the packet, that's correct.
So your customers would be communications providers like AT&T or the Bell system. Do you also sell to government agencies like the National Security Agency or the FBI?
I can't comment on any particular agencies that we may or may not have sold to because they haven't given us permission to announce their names.
Why would AT&T put a NARS STA system in a room in its San Francisco office to which the NSA has access?
That's not a question. So, as far as I know, no one's ever proved anything. I don't know the answer to that question. I have no idea if that's ever been done or not.
You've seen the splitter. You've now got the documents. You've seen the NARS. What is it you think is going on here?
When I saw all that, it all clicked together to me. Oh, that's what they're doing. This is a spy apparatus.
Klein decided to blow the whistle. He went to see the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Cindy Cohen is their senior attorney.
Mark Klein brought us some very good specific information about a specific facility in San Francisco that confirmed a lot of things that we thought were going on. We found a few other experts who know about the telecommunications companies and the issues that Mr. Klein was talking about, and we ran what Mr. Klein had given us past them, and we said, does this fly? Does this hold water to you? And we were told, yes, it does.
Scott Marcus, a former Federal Communications Commission expert, estimated that they set up eavesdropping rooms at 15 to 20 sites across the U.S., intercepting about 10% of all purely domestic Internet traffic. And that's just at AT&T.
We're not talking about just targeted person-to-person communications being handed over to the government. We're talking about something much bigger. We're talking about a wholesale diversion of communications to government control.
In early 2006, the Electronic Frontier Foundation filed suit against AT&T, asking the court to stop AT&T from handing over customer communications to the government.
Our case alleges that AT&T is wholesalely providing the communication records and ongoing live information to the government. That's a violation of law.
In court, AT&T urged dismissal of the case, citing state secrecy. AT&T and NSA refused to talk to Frontline about the case. You're aware that there's a case out here in San Francisco where people are saying that AT&T violated the law by giving the National Security Agency access to all its phone and internet traffic. As a lawyer, is it your opinion that that actually would violate the law?
No, I don't think so if it was part of the President's command or chief power to gather information on the signals intelligence of the enemy.
Can the government pull out the communications it wants, or does it have to have access to the entire flow?
I think the government needs to have at least access to the flow, even if it was going to enforce a warrant, it has to have access to the flow.
Under pressure from lawsuits like the AT&T case and from Congress, President Bush made a dramatic reversal last January. He put the one NSA eavesdropping program that he has acknowledged under the FISA court, but he still claims he has the power to go outside FISA anytime he wants. And the government isn't saying whether the eavesdropping at AT&T in San Francisco is covered by FISA. As far as we know, the narrows box that Mark Klein told us about is still peering into the internet traffic.
Because there's no question we are going to watch what the courts do in the days ahead. The question is, what will be the rights of Americans while that is still being fleshed out? And the fact is, FISA does not specify whether a warrant is required. And I know I'm out of time for this round. I just want you to know, Director Clapper, respectfully, I will be asking this question of you, just like we did with respect to the legal documents for targeted killings, which we finally got after 7 requests over a 2-year period, until we get an answer, because I think Americans are entitled to a direct answer to that question. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Would you like Director Mueller to respond?
I think
it would be helpful.
Madam Chair, I think the director did, and he gave a very thoughtful answer, which is that the courts are still wrestling with the various interpretations of it. I think that is a correct answer by Director Mueller, but we still have the question remaining: what are the rights of Americans as of today while the courts are wrestling with this? And that is the matter we have not gotten an answer to, and I will follow it up again on my second round. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Of individuals on the internet who develop the desire and the will to undertake attacks. They're finding it very difficult to find co-conspirators, others that would join in, but then again, the internet can facilitate that kind of a meeting coming together for an attack. And it is the lone wolves that we are.
Senator Rockefeller, are you okay? No, you're not okay.
No, I am. I think I'm okay. I've got a couple of questions I'd like to ask, but I'd rather get to the closed here.
One, Madam Chair, and I thank you, and this for you, Director Clapper, again on the surveillance front, and I hope we can do this in just a yes or no answer, because I know Senator Feinstein wants to move on. Last summer, the NSA director was at a conference, and he was asked a question about the NSA surveillance of Americans. He replied, and I quote here, "The story that we have millions or hundreds of millions of dossiers on people is completely false." The reason I'm asking the question is, having served on the committee now for a dozen years, I don't really know what a dossier is in this context. So what I wanted to see is if you could give me a yes or no answer to the question, does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?
No, sir.
It does not.
Not wittingly. There are cases where they could inadvertently, perhaps, collect, but not wittingly.
All right. Thank you. I'll have additional questions to give you in writing on that point, but I thank you for the answer.
Perhaps I could ask you to elaborate a little bit on the reasons why you recommended a change in the method of selection, which I agree is very, very important to the trust and confidence in this process. And I think one of the reasons for reforming the whole system is to preserve and enhance trust and confidence of the American people, that we are doing both forms of security here, national security and personal privacy.
Yes, I think it was Justice Frankfurter, I may have the reference wrong, who emphasized both the importance of doing justice and the appearance that justice is done, and that is connected with your point. We also think, particularly in the context of the selection of the judges for the FISA court, a little diversity is a good idea across Democratic and Republican appointees, and as the report makes clear, we have all the respect in the world for the Chief Justice and have nothing critical to say about him in this connection, but it just is the case that if 10 or 11 come from one political party in terms of the appointing president, that's awkward, and so we'd like to see some more diversity.
And again, it's in accord with the traditions of our judicial system that appearance and perception has to be served because of the immense and, in many respects, undemocratic powers that courts exert. Undemocratic because we believe in elections generally, and here we have unelected FISA court members operating in secret, or other members of the judiciary operate in the open, but they too are unelected. And so I think that your point is very, very important, and I, again, thank you all for your service to our nation.
The work that you've done has been very helpful, and I'm confident that it will do a lot to frame this important discussion as we move forward. The importance of these issues can't be overstated. One of the things that I liked that you pointed out in your report appears on page 15, where you pointed out an interesting coincidence, you might call it, my word, not yours. The concept of security has dual meaning. On the one hand, it refers to the fact that one of the most important, fundamental, sacred obligations of government is to keep the people safe, to protect us from each other, and to protect us from those outside of our country who would harm us. Security is one of the most important functions that the federal government has. And at the very same time, it refers to something different. It refers to something else that might appear to be in conflict with, to create tension with that first concept. And that is the concept of security referred to in the Fourth Amendment, that we have the right under the Fourth Amendment to be secure in our persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. Now, this concept of what that means to be secure in this second respect has, of course, changed over time. It has necessarily changed as our technology has changed. But the fundamental principles underlying that concept of security must necessarily remain the same. In order for us to remain a free society, and in order for our constitutional protections to continue to be meaningful. One of the things that we have struggled with as a Congress, and that we struggle with really as a country as a whole, relates to the fact that where we keep our papers and what our papers are has changed, especially in the last few years. No longer do our papers consist exclusively of actual paper. What the founding generation would have thought of as papers often exist only in the ether, exist only in the electronic equivalents of ones and zeros, and those are not any longer stored exclusively on hard drives with a finite location that might be in our home. A lot of the time they exist only in a cloud somewhere, and yet these pieces of information, these papers or effects or whatever you want to call them, in many instances are things in which we have, or at least reasonably should have, an expectation of privacy that is reasonable, to say the very least. And so we have to figure out how best to balance these two sometimes conflicting interests associated with security. There are several ways in which this arises, but we've talked a little bit today about the collection of metadata and the fact that we've got an enormous amount of metadata that's been collected on, potentially 300 million Americans. The government notes that it has in place a rigorous review process that must be followed before anyone accesses this database containing metadata on basically every American. What concerns me about that is the fact that these are basically internal operating procedures. And so what is a policy today, which may well be followed religiously for all I know today, could change tomorrow. And I'm willing to assume for purposes of this discussion that the men and women who work at the NSA have nothing but our best interests at heart. I'm willing to assume that, at least for purposes of this discussion. That might not be the case a year from now, or 4 years from now, or 10 years from now, or 40 years from now. In fact, we've seen this movie before. We know how it ends. We know that eventually, if that much information remains in the hands of government for that long, it will eventually be abused. It will be manipulated for partisan and otherwise nefarious purposes, and we can't let that happen. So let's start with Professor Stone. When we look at this, would this be something that you would describe as one of the most compelling arguments in favor of putting more robust restrictions in law so that they're not simply in the hands of people, however well-intentioned they might be, within the NSA?
Yes, I think this is our primary concern with respect to the collection of metadata, is not the actual use of the metadata in the ways in which it's authorized, but the risk that somewhere down the road someone will figure out how to and want to misuse that data. And so we think safeguards are critical. I should also say, I think the safeguards that are now in place internally are actually quite good. And they're rigorous, they're multifaceted, there's checks and balances, there's the Senate and House Intelligence Committees, there's Inspectors General, there's Attorney General, the FISA Court, all looking over this. But even so, our judgment is that it should be taken out of the hands of the government in terms of the holding of the data. And that reduces, doesn't eliminate entirely, but reduces substantially, we think, the potential for the data to be abused in the ways that you're talking about. And it's still a question of trade-offs, because even there's always a risk. But our judgment is that's an important step towards reducing the risk on one side, while at the same time preserving the value of the data for national security purposes.
I think that's right, and for that reason, Chairman Leahy and I and several of my other colleagues across the aisle have introduced legislation to try to reform this process in one form or another. If I can ask one follow-up on this, additional follow-up on this, Mr. Chairman. Some have suggested that it would simply be infeasible, categorically infeasible, ever to require a court order as a condition precedent for performing a query of the government database. And let's assume, for purposes of this discussion, that the data set will remain, at least does remain for the time being, in the possession of the government, and that we're not going to move to a different system in which the government doesn't have possession. The argument frequently arises, you can't possibly require any kind of a court order as a condition precedent for querying that database, even where you've got U.S. citizens involved in the query, because it would just take too much time. Do you know of any reason why that should necessarily be the case, or why that would unavoidably be the case, why we couldn't get around that by perhaps creating additional FISA court positions?
Well, I mean, we find that wholly unconvincing. I mean, our view is that there are practical realities about it. If you're going to add the burdens to the FISA court, you've got to add resources, you've got to add judges or magistrate judges if necessary, but that there's no reason why the argument about getting a court order for a query of the metadata is any more impossible than it is to get a search warrant to search a home. Fundamentally, this is what we do all the time, and there are great protections in having judges oversee this, and there's no good reason why this should not be adopted in this context as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Chairman.
Yes, Senator Franken.
Thank you.
Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for this report. I think it will be a real help as we work to improve our privacy and surveillance laws. On page 124 of your report, you wrote, quote, "A free people can govern themselves only if they have access to the information that they need to make wise judgments about public policy." I couldn't agree with you more, and right now the American people don't have the information that they need to make up their own minds about these programs.
The theme of our report, consistent with your bill, is that sunlight is the best of disinfectants, as Justice Brandeis said, and that it's very important for the American people, unless there's a very strong national security justification on the other side, to get a sense of what their government is doing. So the first and foremost goal is about democratic self-government and a free society. That's one of the things.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Please have a seat. At the dawn of our republic, a small secret surveillance committee born out of the Sons of Liberty was established in Boston. And the group's members included Paul Revere. At night, they would patrol the streets, reporting back any signs that the British were preparing raids against America's early patriots. Throughout American history, intelligence has helped secure our country and our freedoms. In the Civil War, Union balloons reconnaissance tracked the size of Confederate armies by counting the number of campfires. In World War II, code breakers gave us insights into Japanese war plans. And when Patton marched across Europe, Intercepted communications helped save the lives of his troops. After the war, the rise of the Iron Curtain and nuclear weapons only increased the need for sustained intelligence gathering. And so, in the early days of the Cold War, President Truman created the National Security Agency, or NSA, to give us insights into the Soviet bloc and provide our leaders with information they needed to confront aggression and avert catastrophe. Throughout this evolution, we benefited from both our Constitution and our traditions of limited government. U.S. intelligence agencies were anchored in a system of checks and balances, with oversight from elected leaders and protections for ordinary citizens. Meanwhile, totalitarian states like East Germany offered a cautionary tale of what could happen when vast, unchecked surveillance turned citizens into informers and persecuted people for what they said in the privacy of their own homes. In fact, even the United States proved not to be immune to the abuse of surveillance. In the 1960s, government spied on civil rights leaders and critics of the Vietnam War. And partly in response to these revelations, additional laws were established in the 1970s to ensure that our intelligence capabilities could not be misused against our citizens. In the long twilight struggle against communism, we had been reminded that the very liberties that we sought to preserve could not be sacrificed at the altar of national security. Now, if the fall of the Soviet Union left America without a competing superpower, emerging threats from terrorist groups and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction placed new and in some ways more complicated demands on our intelligence agencies. Globalization and the internet made these threats more acute as technology erased borders and empowered individuals to project great violence as well as great good. Moreover, these new threats raised new legal and new policy questions. For while few doubted the legitimacy of spying on hostile states, our framework of laws was not fully adapted to prevent terrorist attacks by individuals acting on their own or acting in small ideologically driven groups on behalf of a foreign power. The horror of September 11th brought all these issues to the fore. Across the political spectrum, Americans recognized that we had to adapt to a world in which a bomb could be built in a basement and our electric grid could be shut down by operators an ocean away. We were shaken by the signs we had missed leading up to the attacks. How the hijackers had made phone calls to known extremists and traveled to suspicious places. So we demanded that our intelligence community improve its capabilities and that law enforcement change practices to focus more on preventing attacks before they happen than prosecuting terrorists after an attack. It is hard to overstate the transformation America's intelligence community had to go through after 9/11. Our agencies suddenly needed to do far more than the traditional mission of monitoring hostile powers and gathering information for policymakers. Instead, they were now asked to identify and target plotters in some of the most remote parts of the world and to anticipate the actions of networks that by their very nature cannot be easily penetrated with spies or informants. And it is a testimony to the hard work and dedication of the men and women of our intelligence community that over the past decade, we've made enormous strides in fulfilling this mission. Today, new capabilities allow intelligence agencies to track who a terrorist is in contact with and follow the trail of his travel or his funding. New laws allow information to be collected and shared more quickly and effectively between federal agencies and state and local law enforcement. Relationships with foreign intelligence services have expanded, and our capacity to repel cyber attacks have been strengthened. And taken together, these efforts have prevented multiple attacks and saved innocent lives, not just here in the United States, but around the globe. And yet, in our rush to respond to a very real and novel set of threats, the risk of government overreach, the possibility that we lose some of our core liberties in pursuit of security also became more pronounced. We saw in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, our government engaged in enhanced interrogation techniques that contradicted our values. As a senator, I was critical of several practices, such as warrantless wiretaps. And all too often, new authorities were instituted without adequate public debate. Through a combination of action by the courts, increased congressional oversight, and adjustments by the previous administration, some of the worst excesses that emerged after 9/11 were curbed by the time I took office. But a variety of factors have continued to complicate America's efforts to both defend our nation and uphold our civil liberties. First, the same technological advances that allow U.S. intelligence agencies to pinpoint an al-Qaeda cell in Yemen or an email between two terrorists in the Sahel also mean that many routine communications around the world are within our reach. And at a time when more and more of our lives are digital, that prospect is disquieting for all of us. Second, the combination of increased digital information and powerful supercomputers offers intelligence agencies the possibility of sifting through massive amounts of bulk data to identify patterns or pursue leads that may thwart impending threats. It's a powerful tool. But the government collection and storage of such bulk data also creates a potential for abuse. Third, the legal safeguards that restrict surveillance against U.S. persons without a warrant do not apply to foreign persons overseas. This is not unique to America. Few, if any, spy agencies around the world constrain their activities beyond their own borders. And the whole point of intelligence is to obtain information that is not publicly available. But America's capabilities are unique. And the power of new technologies means that there are fewer and fewer technical constraints on what we can do. That places a special obligation on us to ask tough questions about what we should do. And finally, intelligence agencies cannot function without secrecy, which makes their work less subject to public debate. Yet there is an inevitable bias, not only within the intelligence community, but among all of us who are responsible for national security, to collect more information about the world, not less. So in the absence of institutional requirements for regular debate and oversight that is public as well as private or classified, the danger of government overreach becomes more acute. And this is particularly true when surveillance technology and our reliance on digital information is evolving much faster than our laws. For all these reasons, I maintained a healthy skepticism toward our surveillance programs after I became president. I ordered that our programs be reviewed by my national security team and our lawyers. And in some cases, I ordered changes in how we did business. We increased oversight and auditing, including new structures aimed at compliance. Improved rules were proposed by the government and approved by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. And we sought to keep Congress continually updated on these activities. What I did not do is stop these programs wholesale. Not only because I felt that they made us more secure, but also because nothing in that initial review and nothing that I've learned since indicated that our intelligence community has sought to violate the law or is cavalier about the civil liberties of their fellow citizens. To the contrary, in an extraordinarily difficult job, one in which actions are second-guessed, success is unreported, and failure can be catastrophic. The men and women of the intelligence community, including the NSA, consistently follow protocols designed to protect the privacy of ordinary people. They're not abusing authorities in order to listen to your private phone calls or read your emails. When mistakes are made, which is inevitable in any large and complicated human enterprise, they correct those mistakes. Laboring in obscurity, often unable to discuss their work even with family and friends. The men and women of the NSA know that if another 9/11 or massive cyber attack occurs, they will be asked by Congress and the media why they failed to connect the dots. What sustains those who work at NSA and our other intelligence agencies through all these pressures is the knowledge that their professionalism and dedication play a central role in the defense of our nation. Now, to say that our intelligence community follows the law and is staffed by patriots is not to suggest that I or others in my administration felt complacent about the potential impact of these programs. Those of us who hold office in America have a responsibility to our Constitution. And while I was confident in the integrity of those who lead our intelligence community, it was clear to me in observing our intelligence operations on a regular basis that changes in our technological capabilities were raising new questions about the privacy safeguards currently in place. Moreover, after an extended review of our use of drones in the fight against terrorist networks, I believed a fresh examination of our surveillance programs was a necessary next step in our effort to get off the open-ended war footing that we've maintained since 9/11. And for these reasons, I indicated in a speech at the National Defense University last May that we needed a more robust public discussion about the balance between security and liberty. Of course, what I did not know at the time is that within weeks of my speech, an avalanche of unauthorized disclosures would spark controversies at home and abroad that have continued to this day. Now, given the fact of an open investigation, I'm not going to dwell on Mr. Snowden's actions or his motivations. I will say that our nation's defense depends in part on the fidelity of those entrusted with our nation's secrets. If any individual who objects to government policy can take it into their own hands to publicly disclose classified information, then we will not be able to keep our people safe or conduct foreign policy. Moreover, the sensational way in which these disclosures have come out has often shed more heat than light, while revealing methods to our adversaries that could impact our operations in ways that we may not fully understand for years to come. Regardless of how we got here, though, the task before us now is greater than simply repairing the damage done to our operations or preventing more disclosures from taking place in the future. Instead, we have to make some important decisions about how to protect ourselves and sustain our leadership in the world while upholding the civil liberties and privacy protections that our ideals and our Constitution require. We need to do so not only because it is right, but because the challenges posed by threats like terrorism and proliferation and cyber attacks are not going away anytime soon. They are going to continue to be a major problem. And for our intelligence community to be effective over the long haul, we must maintain the trust of the American people and people around the world. This effort will not be completed overnight. And given the pace of technological change, we shouldn't expect this to be the last time America has this debate. But I want the American people to know that the work has begun. Over the last 6 months, I created an outside review group on intelligence and communications technologies to make recommendations for reform. I consulted with the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, created by Congress. I've listened to foreign partners, privacy advocates, and industry leaders. My administration has spent countless hours considering how to approach intelligence in this era of diffuse threats and technological revolution. So before outlining specific changes that I've ordered, let me make a few broad observations that have emerged from this process. First, everyone who has looked at these problems, including skeptics of existing programs, recognizes that we have real enemies and threats and that intelligence serves a vital role in confronting them. We cannot prevent terrorist attacks or cyber threats without some capability to penetrate digital communications. Whether it's to unravel a terrorist plot, to intercept malware that targets a stock exchange, to make sure air traffic control systems are not compromised, or to ensure that hackers do not empty your bank accounts. We are expected to protect the American people. That requires us to have capabilities in this field. Moreover, we cannot unilaterally disarm our intelligence agencies. There's a reason why BlackBerries and iPhones are not allowed in the White House Situation Room. We know that the intelligence services of other countries, including some who feign surprise over the Snowden disclosures, are constantly probing our government and private sector networks and accelerating programs to listen to our conversations and intercept our emails and compromise our systems. We know that. Meanwhile, a number of countries, including some who have loudly criticized the NSA, privately acknowledge that America has special responsibilities as the world's only superpower, that our intelligence capabilities are critical to meeting these responsibilities, and that they themselves have relied on the information we obtain to protect their own people. Second, just as ardent civil libertarians recognize the need for robust intelligence capabilities, those with responsibilities for our national security readily acknowledge the potential for abuse as intelligence capabilities advance and more private information is digitized. After all, the folks at NSA and other intelligence agencies are our neighbors. They're our friends and family. They've got electronic bank and medical records like everybody else. They have kids on Facebook and Instagram, and they know more than most of us the vulnerabilities to privacy that exist in a world where transactions are recorded and email and text and messages are stored, and even our movements can increasingly be tracked through the GPS on our phones. Third, there was a recognition by all who participated in these reviews that the challenges to our privacy do not come from government alone. Corporations of all shapes and sizes track what you buy, store and analyze our data, and use it for commercial purposes. That's how those targeted ads pop up on your computer and your smartphone periodically. But all of us understand that the standards for government surveillance must be higher. Given the unique power of the state, it is not enough for leaders to say, trust us, we won't abuse the data we collect. For history has too many examples when that trust has been breached. Our system of government is built on the premise that our liberty cannot depend on the good intentions of those in power. It depends on the law to constrain those in power. I make these observations to underscore that the basic values of most Americans when it comes to questions of surveillance and privacy converge a lot more than the crude characterizations that have emerged over the last several months. Those who are troubled by our existing programs are not interested in repeating the tragedy of 9/11. And those who defend these programs are not dismissive of civil liberties. The challenge is getting the details right, and that is not simple. In fact, during the course of our review, I've often reminded myself I would not be where I am today were it not for the courage of dissidents like Dr. King, who were spied upon by their own government. And as president, a president who looks at intelligence every morning, I also can't help but be reminded that America must be vigilant in the face of threats. Now, fortunately, by focusing on facts and specifics rather than speculation and hypotheticals, this review process has given me, and hopefully the American people, some clear direction for change. And today I can announce a series of concrete and substantial reforms that my administration intends to adopt administratively or will seek to codify with Congress. First, I have approved a new presidential directive for our signals intelligence activities, both at home and abroad. This guidance will strengthen executive branch oversight of our intelligence activities. It will ensure that we take into account our security requirements, but also our alliances, our trade and investment relationships, including the concerns of American companies, and our commitment to privacy and basic liberties. And we will review decisions about intelligence priorities and sensitive targets on an annual basis so that our actions are regularly scrutinized by my senior national security team. Second, we will reform programs and procedures in place to provide greater transparency to our surveillance activities and fortify the safeguards that protect the privacy of U.S. persons. Since we began this review, including information being released today, we've declassified over 40 opinions and orders of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which provides judicial review of some of our most sensitive intelligence activities, including the Section 702 program targeting foreign individuals overseas and the Section 215 telephone metadata program. And going forward, I'm directing the Director of National Intelligence, in consultation with the Attorney General, to annually review, for the purposes of declassification, any future opinions of the court with broad privacy implications, and to report to me and to Congress on these efforts. To ensure that the court hears a broader range of privacy perspectives, I'm also calling on Congress to authorize the establishment of a panel of advocates from outside government to provide an independent voice in significant cases before the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. Third, we will provide additional protections for activities conducted under Section 702, which allows the government to intercept the communications of foreign targets overseas who have information that's important for our national security. Specifically, I'm asking the Attorney General and DNI to institute reforms that place additional restrictions on government's ability to retain, search, and use in criminal cases communications between Americans and foreign citizens incidentally collected under Section 702. Fourth, in investigating threats, the FBI also relies on what's called national security letters, which can require companies to provide specific and limited information to the government without disclosing the orders to the subject of the investigation. Now, these are cases in which it's important that the subject of the investigation, such as a possible terrorist or spy, isn't tipped off. But we can and should be more transparent in how government uses this authority. I've therefore directed the Attorney General to amend how we use national security letters so that this secrecy will not be indefinite, so that it will terminate within a fixed time, unless the government demonstrates a real need for further secrecy. We will also enable communications providers to make public more information than ever before about the orders that they have received to provide data to the government. This brings me to the program that has generated the most controversy these past few months: the bulk collection of telephone records under Section 215. Let me repeat what I said when this story first broke. This program does not involve the content of phone calls or the names of people making calls. Instead, it provides a record of phone numbers and the times and lengths of calls. Metadata that can be queried if and when we have a reasonable suspicion that a particular number is linked to a terrorist organization. Why is this necessary? The program grew out of a desire to address a gap identified after 9/11. One of the 9/11 hijackers, Khalid al-Mindar, made a phone call from San Diego to a known al-Qaeda safe house in Yemen. NSA saw that call, but it could not see that the call was coming from an individual already in the United States. The telephone metadata program under Section 215 was designed to map the communications of terrorists so we can see who they may be in contact with as quickly as possible. And this capability could also prove valuable in a crisis. For example, if a bomb goes off in one of our cities and law enforcement is racing to determine whether a network is poised to conduct additional attacks, time is of the essence. Being able to quickly review phone connections to assess whether a network exists is critical to that effort. In sum, the program does not involve the NSA examining the phone records of ordinary Americans. Rather, it consolidates these records into a database that the government can query if it has a specific lead. A consolidation of phone records that the companies already retain for business purposes. The review group turned up no indication that this database has been intentionally abused, and I believe it is important that the capability that this program is designed to meet is preserved. Having said that, I believe critics are right to point out that without proper safeguards, this type of program could be used to yield more information about our private lives and open the door to more intrusive bulk collection programs in the future. They're also right to point out that although the telephone bulk collection program was subject to oversight by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court and has been reauthorized repeatedly by Congress, it has never been subject to vigorous public debate. For all these reasons, I believe we need a new approach. I am therefore ordering a transition that will end the Section 215 bulk metadata program as it currently exists and establish a mechanism that preserves the capabilities we need without the government holding this bulk metadata. This will not be simple. The review group recommended that our current approach be replaced by one in which the providers or a third party retain the bulk records, with government accessing information as needed. Both of these options pose difficult problems. Relying solely on the records of multiple providers, for example, could require companies to alter their procedures in ways that raise new privacy concerns. On the other hand, any third party maintaining a single consolidated database would be carrying out what's essentially a government function, but with more expense, more legal ambiguity, potentially less accountability, all of which would have a doubtful impact on increasing public confidence that their privacy is being protected. During the review process, some suggested that we may also be able to preserve the capabilities we need through a combination of existing authorities, better information sharing, and recent technological advances. But more work needs to be done to determine exactly how this system might work. Because of the challenges involved, I've ordered that the transition away from the existing program will proceed in 2 steps. Effective immediately, we will only pursue phone calls that are 2 steps removed from a number associated with a terrorist organization instead of the current 3. And I have directed the Attorney General to work with the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court so that during this transition period, the database can be queried only after a judicial finding or in the case of a true emergency. Next, step 2. I've instructed the intelligence community and the Attorney General to use this transition period to develop options for a new approach that can match the capabilities and fill the gaps that the Section 215 program was designed to address without the government holding this metadata itself. They will report back to me with options for alternative approaches before the program comes up for reauthorization on March 28th. And during this period, I will consult with the relevant committees in Congress to seek their views, and then seek congressional authorization for the new program as needed. Now, the reforms I'm proposing today should give the American people greater confidence that their rights are being protected, even as our intelligence and law enforcement agencies maintain the tools they need to keep us safe. And I recognize that there are additional issues that require further debate. For example, some who participated in our review, as well as some members of Congress, would like to see more sweeping reforms to the use of national security letters. So we have to go to a judge each time before issuing these requests. Here I have concerns that we should not set a standard for terrorism investigations that is higher than those involved in investigating an ordinary crime. But I agree that greater oversight on the use of these letters may be appropriate, and I'm prepared to work with Congress on this issue. There are also those who would like to see, unless there is a compelling national security purpose, we will not monitor the communications of heads of state and government of our close friends and allies. And I've instructed my national security team, as well as the intelligence community, to work with foreign counterparts to deepen our coordination and cooperation in ways that rebuild trust going forward. Now, let me be clear. Our intelligence agencies will continue to gather information about the intentions of governments, as opposed to ordinary citizens, around the world, in the same way that the intelligence services of every other nation does. We will not apologize simply because our services may be more effective. But heads of state and government with whom we work closely and on whose cooperation we depend should feel confident that we are treating them as real partners. And the changes I've ordered do just that. Finally, to make sure that we follow through on all these reforms, I'm making some important changes to how our government is organized. The State Department will designate a senior officer to coordinate our diplomacy on issues related to technology and signals intelligence. We will appoint a senior official at the White House to implement the new privacy safeguards that I've announced today. I will devote the resources to centralize and improve the process we use to handle foreign requests for legal assistance, keeping our high standards for privacy while helping foreign partners fight crime and terrorism. I've also asked my counselor, John Podesta, to lead a comprehensive review of big data and privacy. And this group will consist of government officials who, along with the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, will reach out to privacy experts, technologists, and business leaders and look how the challenges inherent in big data are being confronted by both the public and private sectors. Whether we can forge international norms on how to manage this data, and how we can continue to promote the free flow of information in ways that are consistent with both privacy and security. For ultimately, what's at stake in this debate goes far beyond a few months of headlines or passing tensions in our foreign policy. When you cut through the noise, what's really at stake is how we remain true to who we are in a world that is remaking itself at dizzying speed. Whether it's the ability of individuals to communicate ideas, to access information that would have once filled every great library in every country in the world, or to forge bonds with people on the other sides of the globe. Technology is remaking what is possible for individuals and for institutions and for the international order. So while the reforms that I've announced will point us in a new direction, I am mindful that more work will be needed in the future. One thing I'm certain of, this debate will make us stronger. And I also know that in this time of change, the United States of America will have to lead. It may seem sometimes that America is being held to a different standard. And I'll admit, the readiness of some to assume the worst motives by our government can be frustrating. No one expects China to have an open debate about their surveillance programs, or Russia to take privacy concerns of citizens in other places into account. But let's remember, we are held to a different standard precisely because we have been at the forefront of defending personal privacy and human dignity. As the nation that developed the internet, the world expects us to ensure that the digital revolution works as a tool for individual empowerment, not government control. Having faced down the dangers of totalitarianism and fascism and communism, the world expects us to stand up for the principle that every person has the right to think and write and form relationships freely. Because individual freedom is the wellspring of human progress. Those values make us who we are. And because of the strength of our own democracy, we should not shy away from high expectations. For more than 2 centuries, our Constitution has weathered every type of change because we've been willing to defend it. And because we've been willing to question the actions that have been taken in its defense. Today's no different. I believe we can meet high expectations. Together, let us chart a way forward that secures the life of our nation while preserving the liberties that make our nation worth fighting for. Thank you. God bless you. May God bless the United States of America.
Start dealing with these reforms, to think more broadly, to talk about the Patriot Act, the different warrantless wiretapping programs, and really bring them all in so that the government can't collect information on innocent people anymore.
Ms. Richardson, coming out of December, where the President's Review Panel released 46 different recommendations on the surveillance community, what were your expectations heading into yesterday's speech?
Well, Sadly, the president did not embrace the recommendations of his own review group. I haven't counted them up yet, but out of the 46, I would say he maybe took up like 5 or 6 of them.
Melvin in Lynchburg, Virginia, on our line for Republicans. Melvin, good morning.
Hey, good morning. I just want to first and foremost that the ACLU is probably the least credible group to probably have on here to discuss what's going on with the NSA. Even when the Patriot Act was renewed by most Democrats, I think in 2010, the ACLU still endorsed Barack Obama in 2012. With that being said, I'm listening to a lot of callers who are calling in that are Democrats and Obama supporters, and they're blaming everybody else except President Obama. The man has ordered more drone strikes than any other president in recent memory. The man has put us in more military conflict, which people will not admit and people do not want to acknowledge because they are loyal to Obama. My question to those people who are Democrats and who may call in later is, what's the difference between COINTELPRO and Barack Obama's NSA surveillance? We blamed the president then when we said that they were infiltrating blacks in the 1960s and even groups like the KKK in the 1960s. But now we're saying that the president has no control over it. You people need to get real. And if you support Obama, that's fine, but you need to have a real credible reason why you support him. Y'all have a good day.
Melvin in Lynchburg, Virginia, and on our line for Democrats, Don's waiting in Taylor, Michigan. Don, good morning.
Good morning. I want to thank Chief and thank you. On Obama, I voted for him. And that man, too, from Virginia, I don't believe nothing Obama says. He just, the only thing I saw change was the color of the presidency. But I gauged him on that Patriot Act. He should have been get rid of it, and he never did. And when that got ramrodded through Congress and Bush administration got the Patriot Act in there, people forget that they used the terrorist alert to keep Congress there. They were going for a 4-day weekend. They didn't even read it. They weren't going to let it on the floor. And he knew he had, so he sent people there because it's a false terrorist attack and kept them there. And they hurried up and passed it because they want to get home to their families. But I do not trust Obama. I don't trust him in his government anymore. It just is way too much overboard on the surveillance.
Don in Michigan this morning. We'll be taking your calls and comments.